Chapter 5. When she arrived at home, Vivian found that much had changed. Not only had she unexpectedly spent the better part of the summer in the hospital, but her mother had made some changes to the apartment and moved furniture around to make it easier for Vivian to get around. It was a hard effort in the stairwell, so Vivian did not venture out much at first. But then it became so dull, just sitting there, that she started to make her way down to the street at least once each day, from where she could hobble down to the newspaper and magazine stand, and at least scan the front covers for interesting news. In the apartment, the water ran warm out of the tap, so to stop in the sandwich shop just down the street and get an ice-cold glass of lemonade every now and then felt luxurious. Her mother was working on an entirely new summer dress for the portly, but still socially striving, Mrs. Austin. It was the thing to have pleats, and so Mrs. Austin would have them, regardless of the fact that thin summer fabrics did not lend themselves well to pleating. It was also the thing to create the impression of a long, slim, willow-like silhouette. But there was only so much magic that even a very fine seamstress could render in the face of unavoidable physical realities. Seamstress work was well suited to Vivian's sedentary summer, and she helped her mother for the better part of most days. Nadine came by often to visit, and on one visit she brought over the borrowed copy of Gone with the Wind. After that, Vivian spent many of her mornings sitting in the chair by the window and reading. Scarlett struck her as a rather annoying heroine, with her eternal whining and pining over Ashley. It seemed very silly for her to go on and on about this man who did not appear to have all that much to commend him, who was married to another, and who represented the way of life that had come to an end after the war between the states. Why continue to try for the affections of an unsuccessful man who did not want her, and was not even very compatible with her? Vivian thought it was more than a bit silly. But the descriptions of the burning of Atlanta, the post-war South, the devastation of the way of life of the southern countryside, it all filled her with a real pride to be a Southerner. Vivian had never been up north. Truth be told, Vivian had never been anywhere. But everyone knew that Northerners were very different folk, and not much to be trusted. Nadine agreed on this point, but it seemed that she was only partially interested in the actual past glories of the Old South, and was far more interested in the imagined glories of Rhett Butler, who for sure had to be the most suave and handsome and debonair man of all time. She reread her favorite sections about him out loud to Vivian, while Vivian rolled her eyes, and then they both laughed. "You should be kissed often, and by someone who knows how." "Oh, how I wish a handsome man would come and say that to me," sighed Nadine. "I think if a man were to look at me like I was a piece of mutton and say, 'You should be kissed often and by someone who knows how,' I would give him my sternest look, like this, until he went away," said Vivian. Then she made her face into the most disapproving scowl she could muster. Nadine laughed. "Oh, you will certainly not lure them in with a look like that." She went up and stood by the dressmaker's form, and played with the tape measure that dangled from its wooden neck. "All the same, it is wonderful to be kissed by someone who really knows how. Have you ever been kissed by someone who knows how? Vivian was curious to know. Hardly, replied Nadine, but I have been kissed by someone who didn't know how. Who? Asked Vivian. She was unaware that Nadine had ever kissed anyone. Was it something that had happened during this past summer, while Vivian had been in the hospital? Whom did you kiss? Nadine turned her face back to look at Vivian, a pranksterish gleam in her eye. Well, you know that young man in the ticket booth at the movies? Oh, no, Nadine, you cannot be serious. Even the mere thought. And then the matinee ticket was suddenly half price. No, it's only a joke. I think I've kissed about as many people as you have. But my point is, why would you send Rhett Butler away, this handsome and rich man who knows how to kiss, only to be left with what we're left with in the rest of our lives? Oh, Vivy, promise me that if you ever meet Rhett Butler, that you won't hesitate or make faces, and you'll let him kiss you, and then you will run back and tell me what it was like. Given the extreme unlikelihood of this scenario, Vivian was happy to solemnly swear that she would. Then, while Nadine launched into fresh rhapsodies over her latest favorite book character, Vivian looked at her, and the thought came into her mind whether she should confide to her friend that she had agreed to meet Gregory Morgan for coffee at the Café du Monde. Nadine's visits to see Vivian in the hospital never occurred at the same time as his, and other than making comments on the continued deliveries of flowers, they hadn't talked much about him. Vivian was in no hurry to correct her friend's misperception that the flowers had been delivered by a local florist, rather than by the giver himself. Now that she was going to meet him out in the city alone, though, Vivian began to wish that she had not been so reticent about this topic. Then she could now ask Nadine for her opinion. But since she had not mentioned his multiple visits before, it would be odd now to mention that she had agreed to have coffee with a man whom she had only admitted to seeing once, and that was weeks ago. No, there was no way to explain, without going back and saying all of those things that she had hidden from her friend, which was an unpleasant prospect, so Vivian said nothing. Vivian had not confided in her mother either. She knew that, as much as her mother wished for her to meet an eligible man and to get married, it was very unlikely that her mother would approve of unchaperoned social appointments with an older man well outside of their socio-economic possibilities. Everyone knew that rich men only looked at young seamstresses with one thought in mind: to prey on their innocence. Gregory was not like that, of course, but her certainty came from instinct rather than fact. And mothers definitely preferred fact. The thought that her mother might walk into the hospital and see him sitting there beside her bed had filled her with a constant low-level panic which must have conveyed itself to him, and this would no doubt help to explain why his visits had been frequent but brief. It had never happened, besides that first time, that the visits of Gregory Morgan and her mother overlapped. A nurse had approached one day while her mother was there and began to make some kind of teasing remarks on Vivian's handsome gentleman caller. But Vivian had been able to silence her with an icy glare and then some vague statement about the continued floral deliveries. The nurse took the hint and moved on. Yes, she was keeping a secret now. In fact, she had been keeping it since his first visit to her bedside. Vivian was no stranger to secrets, but she did not think of herself as secretive by nature. She merely thought of herself as a cautious and private person. She also did not like things that did not make sense. And Gregory Morgan, handsome though he was, made no sense. How someone could have met her as a small child, only to run over her a decade later with his bicycle and meet her again, seemed beyond anything that was possible in this world. For days after he had showed her the picture that she had supposedly drawn for him, she lay in her bed and had stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine how this could all be explained as some kind of misunderstanding. But he knew so much about her. It simply had to be true. It was the kind of hokum that she might read about in one of those credulity-straining romance novels. Even the mere thought of repeating this unlikely story to her mother made her squirm. Now that he was nowhere in sight, and her thinking on all of this was more clear, Mr. Gregory Morgan appeared to be some kind of a fake. But how to prove that? And why would he have gone to all this trouble for an elaborate deception? An unexplainable, uncomfortable mystery like him practically demanded to be kept a secret, at least until she could get to the bottom of things. He came across as highly unusual, but not explicitly shady or exploitative. A veneer of politeness and decency shone off of him and in his dark eyes, and she came to the conclusion that he truly believed his fantastical story that he had met her before. And the more they spoke, the more she came to wonder if she could believe in it too. Maybe there was magic like that in this world, throwing people together for reasons no one could yet understand. Maybe... Vivian! Vivian, do be careful, or those pleats will never come out right. Her mother's voice interrupted Vivian's reverie. They'll never come out right anyways, since the fabric is all wrong, mumbled Vivian, annoyed to have been disrupted. It is not for us to question what our clientele wishes us to produce. If these ladies want me to wrap them in nothing but an enormous bag and a gift bow, I would do that, as long as they paid us. But to be free of these petty little projects, and to instead own a fashion house and instruct a whole slew of seamstresses and other designers. This was another one of the fantasies that her mother occasionally indulged in. And although Vivian did not have much of a tolerance for fantasies, at least this one did not involve Vivian marrying someone, so that already made them preferable to her mother's other fantasies. While her mother spoke, in her mind, Vivian counted off the number of days she had still to go before the planned trip to the Café du Monde. She did not want to hobble up on crutches. That seemed too horrible for words. She had made up her mind that Gregory Morgan, be he actually sane or not, would see her stroll over as if nothing had ever happened, graceful and slim and healthy. There was her own vanity, but beyond this, she felt that it would give him pleasure to see her doing well and recovering, that this would be a happiness that she could give him, that in fact she wanted him to have. It was as far as possible from earlier, when she had been blaming him for the accident, but she did not even really remember that anymore. Now she began to leave her crutches propped up in the entrance hallway of the apartment building when she went out, so that she could practice walking unassisted along the sidewalk. The first day, she tried making her way to the newspaper and magazine stand without her crutches, and she had to give up and go back for them. But soon she was making real progress. It wasn't graceful, but she could get it done. Every day, she tried to go just a little bit further, and every day, her hobbling seemed to get a little bit less noticeable. The employees at the sandwich place applauded the first day that she came in without crutches. Some days, her muscles and ribs hurt too much to walk very far. But the thought of having Gregory Morgan's lower jaw hanging open when he saw her next replenished her determination. It was against her nature to have anyone feel sorry for her, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to make him believe that she was well. August ended, and it was 10 days to the arranged appointment, then 8 days, then 6, then just 4. Vivian had pushed herself hard, but it wasn't enough to create a miracle. Well, time to worry about the other logistics now. She was at the moment where she needed to make a plan for how she would get out of the house. "Mother, Nadine has asked me if I would go with her to pick out a new hat next Wednesday," said Vivian. The lie came smoothly, almost comfortably. Her mother let go of the dress hem she was working on, took the remainder of the pins out of her mouth and laid them on the dining table. "Well, I'm glad to see that you mean to take these Wednesdays off. You work far too hard for a girl your age." "Nadine has an appointment at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I promised her I would be there." "Well, advise her to steer well clear of the ones with ridiculously sized flowers and huge plumes. They will make her look like a turn-of-the-century matron. I agree that you young ladies are of an age where you might strive for a bit of femininity and grace, but hats are expensive. Has Nadine come into some money, then? And is it for a special occasion?" asked her mother. "I think she was hoping to wear it on some rendezvous," said Vivian, sidestepping the point about financial means. Nadine and her family were poor as church mice, poorer than even Vivian and her mother. "Rendezvous? Does Nadine have a suitor?" "Not as such. It was more that she thought the hat would make the suitor appear," replied Vivian. Her mother laughed. "Well, she certainly wouldn't be the first woman who ever had that idea. Ah, to be young again and carefree with one's life still before her." "So I would have to leave at 2:30. Is that all right?" interrupted Vivian. "Of course, Vivian. Be careful on those crutches, though, won't you?" "I did not intend to take them," said Vivian. "Now don't be foolish," said her mother sharply. "Don't be vain and don't be impractical. Take your crutches or I will not let you go. Dr. Stark was very clear in his directions. You are not to walk without them for another couple of weeks." Vivian rolled her eyes. "Fine, I'll take them." The days passed by lightning fast, and soon it was Wednesday. Vivian had been on exactly 0 rendezvous with men before, and she found she was nervous to the point of indigestion as she dressed. She had decided to wear her light blue floral dress, on which her mother had recently lengthened the hem. She hoped it made her look older, but she couldn't tell for sure. Her long hair made her look very young, so she tied it back with a ribbon, and she hoped that helped too. How old was Gregory, she wondered. He was a young man, but clearly he was not in school anymore, including college. As the daughter of a seamstress, Vivian knew more about fine tailoring and fabric than did most people, and she had well noticed that Gregory's suits were of a finer make than any bicycle-driving delivery boys had the right to be. There was no helping it. Every thought of Gregory eventually led to the same conclusion, that he was a mystery that made no sense. Vivian finished getting ready, grabbed her handbag and her crutches, and hobbled out the door. There was no point in having her mother see her and inquire why she was wearing her best summer dress to an afternoon of hat shopping with Nadine. She shouted her goodbye to her mother from the hallway and made her way down the stairs to the street, and then the streetcar stop. The streets were busy with people, full of a throng of humanity that she had grown unaccustomed to in her lonely weeks in the hospital and then at home. By the time she got to the Café du Monde, it seemed to her as if the city had never been more full of people. Had it always been like this? She hobbled into the cafe, asked the surprised waitress at the door to hide her crutches behind the counter, and then made her way with the smoothest gait she could muster towards a cafe table outside under the awning. She kept a lookout to see if he was coming, but it was early still. What if he didn't come? What if the thought of meeting her out in the city embarrassed him, and he had had second thoughts about it? She found herself nervously checking the street almost every other minute. Her heart had picked up pace, and a part of her began to wish he wouldn't show up at all. Then she reversed gears and began to panic again that he might never show up. It had been weeks since they had determined on this date. Perhaps he had forgotten. The first indication she got that he had come was when the table of older ladies sitting near her quieted their conversation and turned to stare towards the Decatur Street sidewalk. Until now, she never noticed just how much he stood out, and the fact that he was wearing his usual dark charcoal suit, although just about every other man on the sidewalk was in shades of summer beige, was only the icing on the cake. She saw his dark suited shoulders, his dark hair against his neck, his dark hat swinging in his hand as he stepped under the awning. Then Vivian felt the sensation of wanting to sprint towards him full tilt like a child. Her body rose up from her chair even without her realizing it, and in the first entirely confident crutchless steps she had taken since the accident, she walked towards him, her heart pounding like a drum. He was more beautiful than she had remembered, more beautiful than it was possible for anyone to be. The word handsome never even came to mind because it didn't seem to fit the situation. Her throat felt dry. "You came," she said, gazing up lightheadedly at him. "Mm-hmm," he said, and then he executed a small, theatrical bow. "Mademoiselle." They turned their heads away from the tables, creating a bit of a private space. and he smiled one of those smiles that barely fit on his head. Then he delicately touched her elbow and told her she looked nice, which any girl who has just spent 4 days despairing over which dress to wear appreciates hearing. It was a ridiculous moment, the kind she wanted to both extend indefinitely and also rapidly get over with. And then she said something and he said something else, and she didn't know what it was, since his smile was entirely deafening. Then they turned to walk back to her table, and she caught his gaze and actually saw the color of his eyes for the very first time in her entire life. How could she have thought they were so dark? They were soft-colored, a bit like butterscotch. What must have happened is that a golden sunbeam must have hit him just then, because she had never seen anything that shade in his features before. It was so unexpected, and it disarmed her so completely that she felt her legs weaken beneath her as they reached the table. Was he a magician, and did he do it on purpose? She wondered. It was as if the world shrank all of a sudden for those few brief moments into the small space just around them, before exploding outward again into its regular size, filled with noise and colors and other people. She didn't notice his meticulously starched light shirt collar and elegant vest and tie until they were both seated, where the bright sunlight bounced off of his ridiculously resplendent person and attracted the attention of every single woman there. Vivian felt certain that most everyone there would have been willing to exchange the rest of their life for an eternity of staring at him dressed like that. It made her upset, and then she forgave him, all in the space of 1 second, so that she actually experienced the upset and the forgiveness as one single, complicated emotion, an emotion that she eventually came to associate uniquely with him. Her heart seemed to climb up into her throat. She stared at him and half wondered if her jaw was hanging open. And then he opened his mouth to speak, and all the million little things she had been worrying about just vanished into thin air. "You look rather fetching in color, mademoiselle," he said, his voice catching that lightly jesting, gently sarcastic, but still overwhelmingly warm and friendly undertone that he alone could calibrate. "I just realized that I have only ever seen you in a white hospital gown before. It's true, no one wears a white hospital gown quite the way you do, but in light blue, you are beyond all description." He smiled another easy smile. She felt she was being teased, but found she didn't seem to mind one bit. The waitress approached their table. She took one look at Gregory and almost fell over a nearby chair, or at least that was how it seemed to Vivian. Gregory reached out an arm to help steady her, but his eyes never left Vivian, and his smile didn't diminish in the slightest. The waitress greeted them and asked them what they wished to order. "Do you drink coffee, mademoiselle? Au lait?" Vivian nodded absent-mindedly. Gregory turned his head to look at the waitress. Vivian noticed how she put a hand on the back of the empty chair in front of her to steady herself. "The young lady will have a café au lait and a plate of beignets, and a black coffee for me, thank you." The waitress nodded slowly and then shuffled off, still in a daze. Vivian felt a warmth curling in the pit of her stomach. The young lady will have. When she went out for sandwiches with Nadine or her mother, neither of them had ever said that. It was as if she had suddenly fallen into a magical land full of elegant and exotic customs, a land where she might even be a princess in disguise. "You appear very much recovered," he said to her once the waitress had gone. "I am extremely happy about that. The sunshine and freedom have been good for you, I can see. Can you ever forgive me for the accident?" "I have already forgiven you," said Vivian. "It was one of those events that no one could have foreseen. Moreover, I know you tried to fix things and to do what you could to make sure I got better. Will you ever explain to me what you did?" He shrugged. "Maybe one day, but not today. It was nothing really, and we have too much to catch up on. What have you spent all these weeks doing?" "Nothing very exciting," said Vivian. She told him about helping her mother with her sewing work, of visits with her friend Nadine, and about walking to the sandwich shop and reading. "Not still something about heiresses and aviators, I hope?" asked Gregory, and he made a face. "Perfectly suitable for a young girl such as yourself, I have no doubts, but nonetheless—" "Very funny," said Vivian, scowling. "I would have to be imprisoned in a sick bed again to read another book like that. I'd have preferred anything other. Even the Farmer's Almanac." "No, my friend Nadine lent me Gone with the Wind. Apparently everyone is reading it. It's about the South during the war between the states." Gregory Morgan frowned. "A book about the war between the states? You may have been better off with the Aviator and the Heiress. Many people want to write or speak about the war between the states nowadays, but few have any idea of what they're talking about or what it was really like." "Does it matter very much?" said Vivian. "I mean, it was a very long time ago, so few people know how it really was. The idea is to be true to the spirit of the time, isn't it?" A cloud seemed to pass over his features. "If you are well, let's say a lover of history, then no, that is not enough. Personally, I would insist on more accuracy in my history." Vivian thought about that for a moment. "Well, the novel is about history, but it is also a love story. He loves her, but she loves someone else, and this goes on for hundreds of pages. Are adults really like that? Is love really like that? It seems very foolish." "You're a funny sort of girl," he said after a moment. "When I speak to you, I often forget that you are only 16. Maybe it's because of your practical tone, or maybe because you are an only child and have spent so much of your time around adults. I don't know." He gave her a curious look, then smiled. "And then at other times I forget myself and imagine you to still be only 6, as when I first met you." "You know how old I am, but I don't know how old you are," said Vivian. She waited for him to pick up the thread of conversation, but he had turned his head and was looking out onto Decatur Street. How old are you, Mr. Morgan?" she asked him directly. He turned back and smiled at her, but it was a bit of a tired smile this time. "Old enough not to get excited anymore when it's time to put candles on my birthday cake." It's been many years since I've lived at home. I'm not married. I guess you could say I'm in the part of my life where I enjoy a lot of freedom. Ah, look, here come the beignets. I hope you won't disappoint me and attack these with unabashed vigor. The beignets smelled delicious as the waitress placed them in front of Vivian, and then made a nervous clatter with the coffee cups and saucers before walking away again. I don't know how I will keep my figure if I eat 3 beignets in a single sitting, said Vivian, hoping both that made her sound older and more elegant, as well as hoping that she wouldn't end up eating 3 square puffs of fried dough in a single minute, like some sort of starved ragamuffin. Perhaps you might have one as well? No, thank you. I will stick to my black coffee, he told her. Sweets don't agree with me. Just the sight of that inch-deep layer of confectioner's sugar is enough for me. Vivian added sugar to her coffee, stirred, and then eyed the beignet plate warily. It feels strange to be eating a plate full of fried dough while you just watch me. Mademoiselle, please do not make yourself uncomfortable. I once loved sweets, but sadly my digestion has become more delicate. Allow me the pleasure of enjoying them vicariously through watching you. His smile was beautiful, slightly sad, and full of a tenderness that she had not expected. Is that possible to do? Vivian asked, blushing and picking up a beignet. All of the world's literature presupposes that it is possible to vicariously feel what another is feeling or experiencing. Does it not? Take a bite and tell me that they are delicious, he said. Vivian took a bite and sighed. Yes, they are just wonderful. You are missing out. And you look funny, he said, brushing his fingertip almost imperceptibly across the tip of her nose. It felt like a kind of electricity when he touched her. She felt her eyes grow wide, her mouth still full of beignet. Powdered sugar, he explained. Vivian paused so that she wouldn't speak with her mouth full of food, and then asked politely, What have you been doing all summer? Delivering things, picking things up, going to concerts, riding at night, going out to the country. The same things I usually do, he said. What do you do out in the country? She asked. Ride horses, he said. He took a tiny sip of his coffee as if he was not really sure that he liked it. I have friends out near Thibodeau who keep horses, and I go out there to stay for the weekend when I want to, and then I get to ride. Are you a skilled horseman, then? She asked, finishing her second beignet and reaching for a napkin, lest her nose be covered in powdered sugar again. She was not going to eat the third one, under no circumstances. She sat up straighter in her chair. Passable, he replied with a shrug. And she knew immediately that he had to be a brilliant rider. Oh, to be able to see him ride one day. The waitress came back to refill Gregory's coffee. Vivian thought she caught a forlorn look coming into the waitress's eye as she caught this scrap of conversation. It did seem too much to imagine Gregory on horseback, Vivian had to admit. He was quite enough, as he already was, even without anyone's imagination running amok. She was grateful when he changed the subject. So, tell me about where you live, he asked. What does it look like? Well, I live with my mother in a small apartment near Milnberg. My bed is in the one room, and my mother sleeps in the alcove space. We have a small kitchen. Does it have a lot of sunlight? He asked. Yes, it does. It has larger windows than our old place did. How long have you lived there? For about a year, replied Vivian. Our old place cost too much, and times have been difficult, so I suggested to Mother that we look for another place. I keep our family budget. That is a lot of responsibility for a young girl, he said, sipping his coffee carefully. Vivian noticed how his hands were wrapped around the cup, even though it was a hot afternoon. Like the dark suit in the hot Louisiana sunshine, it seemed not to bother him in the slightest. Mother feels that I do too much work and need to get out more to have fun with young people. That is why she decided I should now have Wednesday afternoons off, she told him. Gregory Morgan smiled his huge smile. So does that mean we can come and do this every Wednesday? Well, perhaps. I suppose we could, said Vivian, hesitating. She would have to come up with a new story for where she was going. Nadine couldn't possibly be hat shopping every single Wednesday, especially seeing as she could hardly afford to shop at all. He saw her hesitation. If you would rather not, that's all right too. No doubt you've many people wishing to have a piece of your time. No, it's not that, she said quickly. She did not want to go into how her mother had no knowledge of this outing, and how that made Vivian less free to come out whenever she wanted to have coffee with him. It would be lovely to meet for coffee again. I won't be able to stay for very long since I owe my friend Nadine a visit as well, but I would enjoy seeing you again. Then we are in perfect understanding with each other, he said, finishing his coffee. They smiled at each other suddenly with a radiant happiness that appeared to shimmer like a visible glory hanging over only their table. He paid, stood up, and helped her with her chair. And then she sailed out of the cafe in front of him as if there was nothing holding her to the earth anymore, the fabric of her dress billowing around her legs. On the sidewalk he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they pushed forward into the bustle of Jackson Square, both ignoring the voice behind them calling, "Mademoiselle, your crutches!" Vivian spent the next week recalling every single moment of her time with him. From the time in the cafe to the moment that he helped her onto the streetcar and then waved as it drove away. She also spent a lot of time thinking of what her story would be for next Wednesday afternoon, so that she could get away and see Gregory Morgan again for coffee. She visited Nadine and made her apologies that she had not been able to come last Wednesday, that her mother had had her working on some urgent items for their lady clients, and that she was not sure if next Wednesday would work either. "My goodness, your mother must be working you to death. Tell her she is pushing you much too hard for a recovering invalid such as yourself," cried Nadine. "Well, I have been away much of the summer, and she did fall behind with things, so I'm doing what I can now to help and at least get her caught up again, lied Vivian, with a smoothness that inwardly appalled her. She had decided on a trip to Pontchartrain Beach next Wednesday, as her news story to her mother. Nadine had mentioned plans for such a trip with some other young people, and it seemed like a good cover. Her mother said it sounded like a fun outing, and told her to take care not to overexert herself. Vivian assured her that she would be careful and would come home early. Then she got dressed in her favorite summer blouse and a skirt and made her way out of the apartment, while her mother was busy talking to a neighbor in the hallway. She got in the sweltering streetcar and rode into town with her heart pounding with excitement. A part of her felt foolish to get so carried away, but then the exuberant feeling inside of her washed over all other sensations and left her feeling giddy and unashamed for it. This time he was waiting for her. He was leaning with cat-like repose against the wall and peeled himself out of the shade to come over to her. She felt herself tense up, hitting upon that discomfort that always seemed to come first in their initial interactions, that squirming discomfort in her because he really was handsome beyond all belief. But then her very next feeling was one that she was joyful that he was there. The more times she interacted with him, the more the space between these two feelings came to vanish, and she experienced them together more and more as that one unique feeling for which there were no words. "Mademoiselle," he said, lifting his hat in genteel greeting, "I am so glad you have come. You look like a radiant vision. She walks in beauty, like the night, of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes." His own dark eyes sparkled at her with humor. "That is nice," she said, feeling still more awkward. "Did you write that?" "Mademoiselle, that is Lord Byron," he said. "Oh," said Vivian, blushing. "I am not a devotee of poetry, but when you recite it, it makes it seem less dislikable." Gregory Morgan laughed his low-throated, magical laugh. "Well, at least there is that. Come, let us take a table. I know for certain that you have an appreciation for sweet pastry, if not for sweet words. Alas, only the sweet words remain for me." They ordered the same things as on their first visit, and as he smiled across at her and asked her about her week, her discomfort started to dissipate. She did not notice as it was happening, but rather found that it gradually came over her, a kind of emotional thawing. And with each minute, her hesitation seemed to decrease, and her smile to grow brighter. By the time the coffees and beignets arrived, it was as if she had stopped falling and was now resting comfortably with him in a soft place. She stopped thinking about whether he was making fun of her or whether he was being genuine. She stopped wondering about his odd, dark suit, or if he thought she looked too girlish in her blouse with bows on the sleeves. She stopped letting the shiny, seemingly impenetrable surface of his beauty make her feel inadequate. She let go of all of these things and let herself be pulled forward into his enthusiastic conversation. "Do you have a favorite holiday? A favorite food? A favorite place? Do you like trains or boats? Candlelight or sunlight? Sunrise or sunsets? Words or music? The past or the future?" he wanted to know. And what about pets? Did you ever have any pets? Do you have a favorite fairy tale? Where have you traveled that you found to be particularly beautiful?" he asked. "Mr. Morgan, is this to be a dialogue or a police interrogation?" said Vivian with a laugh when he finally stopped for breath. "I have to know these things. I have to know," he said with mock seriousness. "And why do you have to know?" she asked. "Why, so that I can know if you are anything like me," he replied. "So what is your answer?" "To which question?" she asked. "Whether I'm like you, or about the sunrise, or pets, or holidays?" "To any of them," he laughed. "Well, I prefer sunlight to candlelight, and sunsets to sunrises, and I've never had any pets. How about you? Do you prefer the past or the future?" He paused for a moment, his eyes taking on a faraway look. "Ah, well, the past. There's nothing quite like the past." "Yes, without a doubt. And you?" "The past," she agreed, finishing her beignet and reaching for her coffee. "Your answers fascinate me, mademoiselle, truly they do," he said, taking another small sip of his black coffee. "I cannot imagine that my opinions would interest most people," said Vivian, "but it is kind of you to be so interested. And you did not ask me, but I may as well tell you that I prefer light-colored buttons to dark ones, silk to taffeta, and pleats to ruffles." He laughed. "Of course. I should have known what to ask a seamstress. Are you a good seamstress?" "Not particularly good," she said honestly. "My mother is the magician with a needle and thread. Dressmaking is an art, you know." "Tell me about it," he said, leaning forward, and the way he said it, in his glossy baritone, made it seem extremely flattering, like he really wanted to hear what she had to say on the topic, like nothing could interest him more in that moment than hearing about the dressmaker's art. His attention was as solid and real of a thing as a caress, as if his hand had smoothed over her hair. She melted with delight. They talked on and on for some time. Then he paid for their refreshments, and they walked through the streets of the French Quarter while he spoke about history and pointed out various buildings to her. At the streetcar stop, they let several streetcars go by so that they could speak together for longer. He was telling her about a small boat that he had once taken down a stretch of the Mississippi, and she felt as if she was with him on that adventure, the waves of the river bobbing the boat up and down, and the sun beating upon them. And she wanted to know how the story ended before going home. Then that story turned into another story, about a time that he sought out to look for a kite that had torn free from his grasp as a boy. Time passed. Vivian listened like someone enchanted, until finally he broke the spell by holding the streetcar door open for her and all but stuffing her through it, as they agreed on next Wednesday, in front of the cathedral. She looked out the window as the streetcar lurched forward, and there he was, waving enthusiastically to her. It was like waking suddenly to some new life and a blissful, happy dream. As the streetcar rode away, she looked out of the window, but saw nothing, her mind still entangled in the past, and trying to imagine Mr. Gregory Morgan as a young boy with a kite. What a sweet image! Her sweet daydreaming made it only all the more of a jolt when the streetcar arrived at her stop. She got out, and she had hardly taken 2 steps when Nadine was upon her. "Vivi, what is the meaning of this? First I go to your apartment to visit you, feeling sorry for you that your mother was working you to death on a Wednesday. Then I discover that you're not even there. And on top of it, I have to quickly find a way to explain to your mother that we had miscommunicated, and I thought I was supposed to pick you up on the way to Pontchartrain Beach. And then I go into town, and there you are, sitting in front of the Café du Monde with a man. Who is he, Vivian?" Vivian swallowed back the rising panic. "Well, no one really." "Vivian Prevette, you'd better come clean with me right now, or I'm marching back in there and telling your mother the entire thing," said Nadine angrily. "You're seeing some older man, and I know nothing about it. Who is he? Where did you meet him? Is he some married man with indecent intentions? Should I be worried?" "No need to be worried," said Vivian hollowly. "Can we talk about this another time? I'm suddenly terribly tired." "We cannot talk about it at another time," Nadine insisted. "Out with it! Tell me who he is. How do I know he isn't dangerous? I thought you had more sense, Vivy. Tell me right here and right now." Vivian sighed. She saw there was no way of getting out of it, so they sat down on a bench, and she told Nadine about Gregory, about how he had come to the hospital to visit her, and how she had met him last week for coffee. Nadine's eyes got wider and wider as Vivian continued her story. She waited for Vivian to finish, then continued with her questions. "I can't believe you kept all this from me. But what do you actually know about this man?" Nadine asked her. "Where does he live? What does he do? Are you sure he doesn't have a wife and 12 children back in his home village? Are you sure he isn't wanted by the police? What is he like? Is he handsome?" Vivian was debating how to answer that last question, but then she felt the hot blush creeping up into her cheeks, and she knew that that was her answer right there. Nadine just stared at her. "He is handsome. I know he is." She threw herself back against the bench. "Does he kiss like Red Butler, do you think?" Now Vivian became angry. "Nadine, how dare you? I wouldn't know. Mr. Morgan and I do not have an improper kind of relationship, and I reject your accusing tone." "Ah, so it's Mr. Morgan, is it?" cried Nadine, returning back from her dream world. "Well, how proper of a relationship can you be having with this Mr. Morgan if you're determined that no one should know about it? I don't understand. You are always so respectable. Do you really think you would get away with it without anybody knowing about it? Your mother will go wild with rage when she hears all of this." Vivian turned pale. You don't plan to go in and tell her all this, do you, Nadine? If you do, I will never, ever be friends with you again." Nadine gave a sharp laugh. "Me tattletale on you? I wouldn't dream of it. What kind of friend would that be? But one of your neighbors, Mrs. Bailey, saw you at the streetcar stop talking intently to a man, and when she stepped out of the streetcar here, she saw me waiting for you and told me she had just seen you back in town with a stranger. I'm assuming that that was Mr. Morgan as well still. Or did you have 2 separate rendezvous?" "Ah, Nadine, stop that. I can't even believe you got me to confess everything to you on pain of telling my mother, only to then tell me that Mrs. Bailey probably already told her everything. I would never have believed you could be so underhanded. Oh, Mrs. Bailey, of all the rotten luck, for that busybody to have seen me. I would wager anything she's been to my mother already," Vivian despaired. "What will I tell her? I cannot go home and forget any more Wednesdays off. My mother will probably not let me out of the apartment ever again. Will you walk home with me, Nadine? She may not kill me right away if you are there." Nadine gave Vivian a pointed look. "Go and face the music," she said, and then she turned and walked away. The ensuing scene with her mother was every bit as uncomfortable as Vivian had feared. Her mother was furious and panicked. "Vivian, how could you do this thing?" she shouted. "Who is this man? How long has this been going on? What were you thinking? Why, haven't I told you 1,000 times how a girl's reputation must be her most prized asset? Even one whiff of impropriety is enough to ruin your chances for a good marriage. And you would do this to me, your mother. You would lie to me, make me worry like this. You should be ashamed of yourself." Vivian explained that she had met Gregory Morgan while in the hospital, that they had only met for coffee twice since then, that he was decent and upstanding, that he was clearly well-bred and entirely polite, but her mother was having none of it. "His actions condemn him!" she cried theatrically. "No well-bred young man would presume to invite an unchaperoned young girl to a private afternoon tete-a-tete." "But it was outside the Café du Monde, at a table out front by the sidewalk." "Hardly a private place," argued Vivian. "Oh, so the entire city saw you! What an embarrassment!" her mother cried. "I don't understand. It would be terrible if we attempted to be alone, but it is also unforgivably terrible that we were somewhere highly visible," said Vivian. "Don't think to argue with me, young lady," her mother said. "Say goodbye to those Wednesday afternoons off. And if I so much as catch the insinuation that you are having any further unchaperoned visits with this or any other young man, I shall make your life a misery of constant surveillance." With that, her mother stormed off to the kitchen corner. Vivian went to stand by the window. A terrible, ripping feeling tore at her underneath her ribs. She looked down into the street and felt the tears start to slide down her cheeks. For a moment, she thought that what she must be feeling was guilt and remorse at what she had done. But then in the next moment she realized with surprise that it was not remorse at all. It was the terror of not seeing him again. She knew Gregory Morgan's name, and she knew that he lived in the city and delivered repaired antique books by bicycle. She also knew that he was well educated, had grown up near New Orleans, rode horses well, rode bicycles poorly, disliked sweets, wasn't married, and preferred the past to the future. But she had no idea where he lived or where the book repair shop was that he worked at. They should have had more practical conversations in their last 2 visits, rather than this fluff that would now not make it possible to find him. The only way she could reach him again was to find some way to get to the St. Louis Cathedral next Wednesday by 3 p.m., as they had planned. And that was beyond unlikely, unless she was prepared to run off and never come home again. She cried quietly at intervals throughout the evening, and as her mother also interpreted her tears as remorse, the night ended with her mother patting her on the shoulder, telling her to calm herself, and just to not be so foolish in future, and to go to bed. Vivian lay in the dark and stared up at the ceiling. She knew instinctively that the choice in this moment was all hers, and that if she took no action, that Gregory Morgan would vanish from her life without a trace. If she wanted him gone, all she had to do was not show up next week, and that would be the end of that. She thought for a long time how she felt about that, and then what it would be like to live with the remorse later, once he was beyond reach, and she had just let him go. It seemed important to make the right choice here, and the wrong choice could have far-reaching consequences. But even if she miraculously found a way to get into town in a week's time, how could any friendship with Gregory Morgan unfold while her mother was so strongly opposed? Vivian was surprised to discover that Nadine and her mother were right. Here was a strange man about whom she knew next to nothing. It had never felt that way to her when she was talking to him. He had long ago stopped seeming like a stranger to her. She believed she could trust him, but she couldn't explain why this would be the case, and the inability to explain it had made her reticent to talk about it with anyone. Perhaps she should just let him wait and wait in front of the cathedral until he gave up and walked away. There was no chance that a friendship between them could even work out. All right, maybe there was just a very, very small chance. but that hardly seemed worth taking the risk for. She woke up in the darkness, her body all damp with cold sweat. In her nightmare, she had been running and running. She was not sure whether from some terror or towards some salvation. She could hear her mother's calm, regular breathing from across the room, but somehow it didn't make her feel any less alone. In that darkness, she felt certain that she would never know happiness again, and she cried and cried into her pillow, trying to keep as quiet as possible. Then, when her eyes hurt too much to keep on crying, she turned to her favorite consolation and imagined her young and handsome father sitting on the chair by her bed. She told him that she did not know what to do, that she was deeply miserable, and she waited for his reassuring presence to enter into her mind. "It's all right, my dearest one. Things are not as bad as all that. Don't worry about anything right now. I'm here, and everything is all right. In the morning you will know what to do. Sleep now. I won't let anything bad happen to you." But when she woke up, tired and sore-eyed the next morning, she still did not know what to do. She knew what the sensible answer to her situation was, but not what the right answer was. And it suddenly seemed very important to get it right. How much could this stranger really matter to her in her life? He could not matter at all, or he could be central to everything that was to come. What to do? She kept thinking of Scarlett as Rhett was leaving, suddenly aware of the immense loss that she was about to bear. "Rhett, if you go, what shall I do? Where shall I go? I can't let him go. I can't." But in Vivian's case, what was there to hold on to when her mother was set against this friendship? Prudence and stubbornness, two of Vivian's strongest attributes, thus clashed within her. It was 3 nights later, frequently interrupted by waking up and shaking in panic, when she finally came to a point of decision. And she knew as soon as she made it that it could never be unmade, and that she would have to live forever with its consequences, whatever they turned out to be. That day, she took her decision and made herself an inward promise that, come what may, she would never look back.